History of the Death Penalty, A Balanced Perspective by Professor Dave Heffernan of Lancia College. This is Part 4 of 5. Review of Part 3. With the advent of electricity, electrocution became a dominant form of execution. In 1890, convicted murderer William Kemmler was executed by alternating current electricity. The Supreme Court ruled that the electric chair did not violate the Eighth Amendment. While it was unusual, it was not considered cruel. For 50 years, the precise mechanism of death was still unclear. In 1921, Nevada began using gas for execution. Executions on the decline. 1935 was the peak year for executions in America, at 199 executions. 1951 was the last year with more than 100 executions. In 1968, for the first time in U.S. history, not a single person was executed. Abolition. Between 1847 and 1853, Michigan, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin abolished the death penalty. Iowa abolished the death penalty in 1872, but it was restored in 1878. Maine, abolished in 1876, restored in 1883, and then it was abolished again in 1887. Colorado abolished it in 1897, however it was restored in 1901. By 1910, abolitionists included many prominent and outspoken people, including governors of New York, California, Oregon, Illinois, Arizona, and Oklahoma, all who made public announcements opposing the death penalty. Between 1907 and 1917, 9 states abolished the death penalty, including Kansas, Minnesota, Washington, Oregon, North and South Dakota, Arizona, and Missouri. The end of legislative abolition. Legislative reform came to a stop between 1917 and 1919. The U.S. officially entered World War I on April 6, 1917. Of the 15 states that had done away with capital punishment by 1917, by 1920 only 8 were left. The death penalty would remain a prominent issue for the rest of the century, but the era of legislative abolition was over. Administrative abolition. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt announced that he would like to see capital punishment abolished throughout the country. The 1930s brought an extended period of what is described as administrative abolition. From the 1930s to the 1950s, America saw a drop in death sentences and subsequent executions. Some of the drop was attributed to World War II, quote, when the military absorbed some of the men that would have otherwise committed murder, end quote. Race and abolition. While the northern states were debating about abolishing capital punishment for murder, the southern states had barely changed their capital codes and were still executing for rape, robbery, arson, and burglary. Throughout the South, for all crimes, black defendants were executed in numbers far out of proportion for their population. The death penalty was a means of racial control, according to Banner. The South accounted for 65% of executions in the 1940s. Lynchings. Lynchings reached their peak in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which was an additional barrier to change. According to Banner, lynchings were a form of unofficial capital punishment, adjudication of guilt and execution by groups lacking the formal authority for either. The victims were usually black and the executioners usually white. Official trials and executions in the South often closely resembled lynchings when it came to a case that included racial implications. At its peak, lynchings were much more common than official capital punishment. For example, in Kentucky between 1865 and 1940, there were 229 executions. However, there were 353 lynchings documented. The Supreme Court. On June 29, 1972, in a group of cases collectively called Furman versus Georgia, the Supreme Court declared that the death penalty was unconstitutional as cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment. The 5 justices that formed the majority each wrote their own opinion, and there were a few points that 2 or 3 of them agreed on. In all, there were 9 opinions in Furman v. Georgia, filling 223 pages, the most of any case in history of the court at that time. There were 600 inmates on death row that had their sentences vacated. Evolving standards of decency. It has been said that the Eighth Amendment must draw its meaning from the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. At the time of Furman v. Georgia, some argued that the justices' standards were changing faster than the general population. Furman immediately sent out a flurry of legislative activity in many states. An 8-point margin in favor of capital punishment had grown to a 25-point margin in just 7 months after Furman. The Supreme Court, death penalty revisited. On January 1996, the court announced that it would hear 5 murder cases, 1 each from Georgia, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, and Louisiana. The defendant in the Georgia case was known as Troy Gregg, and the cases collectively became known as Gregg v. Georgia. In light of what the 35 states had done since Furman, Justice Stewart explained, "One can no longer argue that capital punishment is incapable of evolving standards of decency." Ultimately, 7 of 9 justices agreed to sentencing schemes that guided the jury with aggravating and mitigating circumstances. The ruling was published on July 2, 1976. Gregg v. Georgia was being considered in 1996. Let's look at the death penalty demographics during that time. In 1996, whites supported capital punishment 75% to 18%, while non-whites supported it 54% to 35%. Men supported it a bit more than women, Republicans a bit more than Democrats, the rich a bit more than the poor, but it was equally popular in all parts of the country. Death for murder only. 1 year after Gregg v. Georgia, in Cooker v. Georgia, the court held that the death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment for rape. The Eighth Amendment also prohibits executing the insane and the mentally retarded. Lethal injection. When the death penalty resumed in 1976, the electric chair and gas chamber were the primary methods of execution. By the turn of the century, lethal injection was the dominant method of execution. It literally swept the country. As an example, of the 98 inmates executed in 1999, they died in the following way: 1 by gas chamber, 3 by electrocution, and 94 by lethal injection, which equates to 96% of the executions being by lethal injection. In 1997, Oklahoma and Texas became the first to utilize lethal injection in a 3-step process. The first step was adding sodium thiopental, a fast-acting barbiturate which produced unconsciousness. Then pancronium bromide, a muscle relaxant, paralyzed the lungs, and finally adding potassium chloride, which stopped the heart. The American Medical Association barred physicians from taking part in executions. They were limited to providing a sedative and performing the autopsy. Lethal injection wasn't without its share of issues. Sometimes inmates had reactions to the drugs, experiencing gasping and choking in the final minutes. The unsuccessful lawsuit by the Legal Defense Fund, who, ironically, argued that the drugs could not be used because they had not been approved as safe by the Food and Drug Administration. Some companies have refused to sell drugs to states intending to use them for execution. Let's take a moment and consider how some of America's most prolific murderers were executed. First was Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. Next, Ted Bundy, who was a serial killer who killed 30-plus women, with his final murders occurring at Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house in 1978. Then there was Jeffrey Dahmer, the serial killer who had killed 17 boys and men. and he was known to be necrophiliac and cannibal. Then there was John Wayne Gacy, a serial killer who killed 33 young men. And Gary Gilmore, a murderer. And you know how William Kemmler was killed. He murdered his wife with a hatchet. And he said, "I killed her, and I'll take the rope for it." Then there was Barbara Graham, the murderer who received the name Bloody Babs. And then finally, John Wilkes Booth, who murdered President Abraham Lincoln. Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168, many of which were children, was executed by lethal injection in 2001 while in federal custody. Ted Bundy was executed in the Florida electric chair, Old Sparky, in 1989. Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate in prison. John Wayne Gacy died of lethal injection in 1994. Gary Gilmore was executed by a firing squad in Utah State Prison in 1977. And you'll remember William Kemmler, who admitted to the murder of his wife. He said, "I killed her, and I'll take the rope for it." He was the first electrocution in 1890. Barbara Graham, Bloody Babs, died in a gas chamber in 1955. And John Wilkes Booth, who murdered President Lincoln, was shot in the neck in 1864. Review of Part 4. 1935 was the peak year for executions in America at 199 executions. Between 1847 and 1853, 3 states had abolished the death penalty. Between 1907 and 1917, 9 states had abolished the death penalty. Legislative reform came to a stop between 1917 and 1919. Of the 15 states that had done away with capital punishment, by 1920 only 8 were left. Northern states were debating about abolishing capital punishment for murder, while in the South, the death penalty was seen as a means of racial control. Lynchings were also a form of unofficial capital punishment. Lethal injection became the #1 method of execution after its approval in 1997. Thank you.